Hello, and welcome back to Tiny Artist TV. Today is going to be the third video in our March of Robots series. So that means we're going to be using the Draw It app to randomly select a beast to mechanize. And we're going to be using not the coolers.co app, but the what was it? I'll put it up on the screen, but using the app on my phone to randomly generate the palette for our creature. So let me grab my phone because I forgot to do that before I started recording. Okay, so we're using the Pigment app for the color palette, and our random creature for today is going to be, let's see, the Hydra. Which is interesting because we had Cerberus 2 weeks ago, and if you actually watch that video, you'll know that the Hydra is actually related to Cerberus being one of the sons? One of the offspring of Typhon, like Cerberus is. So let's go ahead and pull up the color palette, and that's going to be this one here. So, boop. And then, of course, instead of doing this digitally, we're going to be doing this one traditionally as well. So let's go ahead and head to the studio. So even though we are going to be sculpting today's video, I do still want to start with the sketch just because I've never sculpted anything of this size before. I have been watching a lot of clay making tutorial videos, mainly over on Ace of Clay's channel. And he's got a pretty extensive library of like in-depth tutorials, and every time he sculpts something, he explains what he's doing. So I gather all of my necessary tools. I've got my aluminum foil to bulk out the structure. I've got my heavy-duty wire for the necks and any other appendages and things that I may need for this creature. And I also, off to the side, have a little bowl of water with a sponge in it, and that's just to reincorporate moisture into the structure as I'm working with it. And then up top I have a bowl of slip, which is just clay mixed with water, and it basically acts as like a smoother and an adhesive. So I've bulked out my main body, and now I'm just cutting wires for the neck and the tail. And as you can see, I've got my sponge, and my clay, even though it was still pretty soft right out of the bucket, it wasn't as soft as I needed it to be to do what I needed with it. So I just take my sponge and dab a little bit of water on it, and I keep working it and kneading it until it's like a nice doughy consistency. It's flexible enough for me to bend around this without any tears or any other kind of weird lumps and bumps that may end up in the clay as it's drying. I'm avoiding the neck holes mainly because I know that I'm going to cover those with clay later as I'm actually forming the different necks for the Hydra. So I also want to still be able to see where I need to put my wires into. So now I'm just bulking out the body a little bit more. The main purpose of starting out with the aluminum foil is so that you don't have to use like 20 pounds of clay, because I only had a 5-pound bucket to start out with, and it was actually half empty because I used this bucket for other projects. So I was pretty much starting out with about maybe 3.5, 4-ish pounds of clay, and I do end up using most of it by the end of this video just because there's so much stuff that goes into all the different parts, and just you'll see. So now I'm situating the necks, figuring out based on the sketch that I did earlier where I want things to bend, and translating it from sketch into 3D. This is where it gets a little not tricky necessarily, but it can sometimes translate a little differently. I mainly wanted to make sure that I had enough space between the heads and necks because I knew I was going to be adding a little more detail to the necks, but I also wanted to make sure I had enough room to paint in between the heads when I get to the painting stage later. So now I'm just gathering a little bit more clay to start on the feet. I just do these 2 medium-sized balls and kind of flatten them out into like a soft rectangle type shape, curve it down a little bit for the toes, and I take one of my palette knives to split it. I am separating the toes right now to attach the toenails, but I do squish the toes back together. But this just helps with making sure, once again, that your details aren't getting squished together when they don't need to be squished together, and you can really like get in there and put details on each individual. Like you can add knuckles and wrinkles and things like that without, if you finish one toe without messing up the other several, whatever, how many toes you're doing for your project. You'll see at several points where the clay looks a little shiny, and that's just me dipping my hand into the pot of water that's off screen and smoothing things down as I go. This clay is firm, but it is also very forgiving. So even though it is like, you know, it's Crayola brand, you may think, oh, it's not one of these higher end clay brands, blah, blah, blah. It still works very well. I have used this clay several times. And actually, it's been a while since I've used this specific bucket of clay, and it's still held up as long as you keep it out of the air. So now that both feet are finished, I am rolling out clay for the paws. However, I don't actually end up using these balls of clay for the paws. I end up using these as scrap clay for other sections of the Hydra and just make the paws at the very end. But you can see where the idea was, where I was trying to place them. So now I'm beefing out the legs. I'm just taking some strips of aluminum foil and bending them like knees, wrapping it in clay, and then attaching it onto the side and making sure that it looks, you know, at the very least decent and more like a dragon and less like a frog. Because after I attach both legs to the side, I take a look at it and decide that the thighs need to be a little bit thicker, because starting out they did look a little noodly and a little froggy. So I just kind of add some more clay to the edges and bulk it out and really give it some musculature, so you can kind of see the quads, not from this angle necessarily, but when you're actually holding the sculpture, it kind of looks like he's got some actual muscle there, something that can hold up his all of this chest and body and the heads and everything that's going to be on there. Just adding a little more detail into the legs, like what I did with the feet earlier. I just took my palette knife and did a little jagged, rough, wrinkly, like T-Rex texture to it. Trying to place the tail, and it's not quite sitting where I want it to. So I actually thought about scrapping that particular piece of armature and just doing the tail completely out of clay. But then I changed my mind once I realized that that's a terrible idea, and I don't have any way to actually attach the tail without the wire, without risking it cracking after it's dried. And here, again, just adding more detail to the legs. I ended up attaching and smoothing the tail off camera so we could skip ahead to the fun part, which is molding the heads. So, starting out, I just kind of adjust everything to make sure that it's absolutely where I want it to be. And now this is kind of less based on the sketch and more based on where I think things will fit best, again, when I'm trying to mold everything out. So I take my aluminum foil and just bulk out the necks, and this keeps everything nice and lightweight so that there's less tension on the body, because the body is also mostly aluminum foil, even though the legs and the tail are really supporting it and holding it down. I don't want things to flop over or flop around while I'm working on these like skinny dragon necks. The other thing that I was concerned about was, cracking because these necks are thin. So having the aluminum foil have texture and help hold that clay in place as it's drying also helps to keep it from cracking. So again, even though this clay is air dry, like I've used it before and it's pretty good at behaving like a higher end clay or even like an oven baked clay, as long as you don't over moisturize it and you don't put it in an extreme heat setting to dry, because that will cause air bubbles to come out of the clay and cause it to crack. So pretty much working with just the raw clay, adding a little bit of slip where I need to, and that's again just to smooth things over, because the slip also kind of acts like a glue for your clay. It helps cover up any kind of fingerprints. It also helps with blending pieces of clay together, like what I end up doing with the necks. So now, as you can see, it just looks like one nice smooth piece, and that's because of the slip and the blending and just using thin pieces of clay and just using the natural form and texture of the aluminum foil to keep things nice and noodly. So now, after I'm done fussing with the neck and the tail, I am adding the line for the ridges and figuring out where I want everything to go, because I know that not all 5 of the neck ridges are going to line up with the tail. I pretty much just have what would have been the original head lining up with the tail, and then each of the heads just kind of has this like half ridge situation going on. So to make the ridges, I just rolled out a rope of clay and I am placing it along the line that I scored with my palette knife. And this is the easy part. Basically, I'm just building up where I want my design to go. And I do change the design just a little bit. I start out with this kind of like squiggly type situation, and then I decide I want it to look a little rougher and a little more aquatic. Since the Hydra, if you couldn't tell by its name, is an aquatic monster. Now, it was supposed to be a sea serpent-esque type dragon. That didn't even make sense. You guys know what I'm trying to say, right? But instead of going with snake-like heads and features, I go with more eel-like features, like the long scraggly fin that they tend to kind of have going down their body, or at least the ones in The Little Mermaid did. I didn't actually look up pictures of eels before I started sculpting this thing, because hydras don't exist and I can make it look however I want. So we're just gonna go with that. But yeah, like the ridge, and as you can see here, it's just kind of this like soft squiggly texture. And even though I really like the way this turned out, I didn't think that it was gonna hold up as far as the dynamism of the whole piece in the long run, because it just kind of falls into the background. So I wanted to do something that was going to have a little more flair to it. To achieve that look, I just take the smaller ropes of clay that I made for the other necks, and instead of attaching it and then texturing it, I take the roll and I pinch it and I kind of press towards the edges to give these wrinkled, kind of more like a fin type texture. There's some like rips in there and some tears. They kind of make it look like this guy has been through some battles, because if you know anything about the Lernaean Hydra, this is one of the 12 monsters, or one of the 12 feats that Hercules had to accomplish by defeating the Lernaean Hydra I'm not going to spoil the story, read it yourself, but this guy has seen some things. So, and I really just like the way that the ruffles look much better. They give the heads much more movement, because this is a still statue, so you have to have all of the surrounding elements create movement for you. And once again, I'm using my slip as sort of a glue and smoother. Like, you don't have to have slip when you're doing air dry or traditional clay sculptures, but it's definitely helpful, especially when you're working with fine details that you're afraid may break off. This helps kind of just lightly add small reinforcing layers to it as you're working with it and smoothing things out. And again, just making sure that it's got a nice secure attachment to the rest of the piece. And so I'm mainly doing it around where the base of the ridge meets the neck, and just building up those layers of just liquid clay so that it can get in all the cracks and crevices and really like give it a nice secure place to hold on to. And here I am getting started on the shoulders and the arms. I'm just taking 2 balls of clay and making sure that I have the same amount of clay working for each arm. Unfortunately, my camera did die shortly after this part, and so while it was on the charger, I do finish the arms off camera, but I do have, and I did the heads as well, but I do have pictures of, here's the armature. I do end up switching the position of the arms, but to do the heads, I made aluminum foil balls, and then I cover it with a thin sheet of clay, and just kind of form it into these like little almond type shapes to give it a little snoot, and make sure that the back of the neck is hollow so that I can attach it onto the neck, as you can see here. And then I just take that point and attach it onto the neck stump kind of like a sock, and then just press and blend everything together. So here he is after drying, mostly drying overnight. I did leave one head off. Originally I was thinking about leaving that one as like a neck stump, but then I figured I'd go ahead and do one of the heads on camera for you guys. So I'm just mixing up a fresh batch of slip here. And as you can see, I have also bought a vase. So last night after filming, I did end up having to go into work, so while I was there I picked up some supplies to finish this off. I bought some more clay for, not next week, but the next video, and a couple things for that, and a base for this guy, so I wouldn't have to keep picking him up and moving him around, because it's, even though he's mostly solid right now, I don't want to keep picking it up and risk cracking it, because it's still drying, and I don't want to warp any of the structural integrity of it. So for the duration of taking some slip and just finishing everything off, I use the base to turn my work. And starting on the last head, I kind of adjusted that ridge on top just to make sure I would have enough room for it to sit. And also, instead of having the head go out to the left, I kind of turn it upwards a little bit, and you'll see what that looks like after I attach the sock portion of the head on there. Just blending in the ridge. And I did use my palette knife to slice the mouth open. Using my slip to blend it better into the neck just to make it a little smoother, a little more eel-like texture. I'm figuring out where to position it on the base. And now I'm getting started with the claws. Initially I was going to do 3 claws on each hand, but then I do 2 claws on the other hand while I'm, making the 3rd claw. And I really like the way that looks, so I do end up ripping one of the claws off of this first paw here, and so he ends up having kind of like velociraptor paws. But I also thought it made him look less, again, Western dragon and more just sort of Greek mythical aquatic monster somehow, more so than having 3 claws would do for him, even though I go through all this trouble of making the skin around the claws and the knuckles. But sometimes that's the way things go. Sometimes things don't really work out and you can just rip it off and start over. So now that the body is done, it's time to start on the base. So just making some simple rock forms here with some bunched up aluminum foil, and again I'm just taking some thin sheets of clay and covering the form, and then taking some smaller balls of clay and kind of pinching it together to give it a rocky texture. I'm just messing around with it and playing around with the clay until I get a form that I like. And for the larger parts in the middle, I'm kind of playing around with the idea of making them not just rocks, but some ruins that this hydra may have destroyed. So I take my palette knife and score it, and now I'm just taking my sponge and giving on the rough side and giving it a little bit more rocky, grainy texture to it. And for this next one over here, as you can see, it was originally supposed to be just a pile of boulders, just like the other one, but then a part of me thought, well, what if not boulder, but what if broken statue? And I spent probably the next 30 minutes, 45-ish minutes sculpting out this head and shoulders before I decide that I don't like it. Well, it's not so much that I didn't like it, it's just that it was too much. Because the focus is supposed to be on the hydra, and so having this head and shoulders in the back just kind of had too much going on with it. So I go through all the effort of sculpting out this head and doing the eyebrows and making sure the nose is just fine, and doing the lips and then ripping the lips off and then redoing the lips. And I even made ears for this thing, and end up scrapping it too. So like I said, you know, sometimes things just don't really work out, but it was good practice for sculpting human structures, which I haven't done, because typically when I sculpt, I do weird monster animal type things. So yeah, like I said, at least I got some practice in. So now that everything's covered, I thought about, you know, adding some detail to the armor and some pauldrons and some things like that. Again, this was before I looked at everything and decided that it was going to be just way too much going on in the background, and going back to just doing the simple rocky base. I thought about doing some kind of Medusa type hair with it, and then I thought maybe to make it a little more Greek, because the face was definitely more old man than old woman or Gorgon. I wanted to give it this like olive leaf crown. You guys, like honestly, I am a little upset that I put so much time and effort into all of that head and shoulders just to get rid of it, but it is what it is. So now I'm moving on to the next set of broken building structure. Just kind of making this little like bench horseshoe type thing with the aluminum foil, and again taking the rough side of my sponge and just dabbing everything down. And then I get another brilliant idea. But before I do that, you can see I'm kind of hesitating here, and I decide to get rid of the head at this point. I'm just kind of stalling and adding more clay to the structures that I know I'm going to keep, or at least I think I'm going to keep. Spoiler alert, I don't end up keeping the other piece either, because again, it's just too big and it's too bulky, and once I bring the Hydra back onto the platform, there's just way too much going on that's not directly necessary with the Hydra structure. So there goes the head, and instead of getting rid of this whole thing, I just take the bits of clay that I had from the hair or whatever else I was gonna do and just scrunch it up and add it back over that hole, and it looks like a rock. And if I hadn't put this in the video, you never would have known it was there. So because I'm not one to waste materials, I take what clay I can salvage from the head, and then I just scrunch it down and make it into another rock form to join the big boulder section. Now I'm playing around with the idea of adding a column to the structure. Initially I had wanted to do just like some columns sitting around the Hydra kind of broken up into pieces, and so this is a remnant of that idea. And even though, again, it looks fine, but it's just that once I add the Hydra back in and see where everything's sitting, it's just too much clutter, and I decided to get rid of it. So here's the beefy boy sitting in his new environment, and you can see where having that back row of bricks would have definitely been way too cluttered. So now that I know where I want to put everything, I'm just taking some slip, and I made an extra batch of it, and I added more clay so it would be a little stickier, and now I'm just spreading it all over to create this rough rocky type texture. Not doing anything too special with it. I am taking, kind of scraping out the bottom and getting those extra lumps of clay to maybe like add extra rocky texture to it. A lot of the detail is going to really pop out once I do the paint job, and of course that's going to be in the next part. So to finish this off, I'm just adding a layer of the more liquidy slip and smoothing everything out that needs to be smoothed, and I'm just really taking the time to fill in some of the smaller spaces here. Okay guys, so this concludes part 1, which is the sculpting of the Hydra for this week's March of Robots prompt. As you can see, I kind of left the robot part of it off to the wayside, but yeah, join me for part 2, which will be the painting. I'll post that sometime later this week, and until then, see you guys next time. Have a weird day.